From KCBS Radio in San Francisco, I'm Matt Pitman, and this is Bay Current for Thursday, January 20th. Today marks the one-year anniversary of Joe Biden being sworn in at the Capitol, a Capitol that was still being patched back together after the insurrection on January 6, 2021. Much of Joe Biden's message on this day last year was centered around bringing the country back together, finding ways to reach across the aisle, bring an element of bipartisanship back to Washington, D.C. and our national political discourse, and, of course, trying to deal with what at the time we thought was a COVID pandemic that was going to look a little bit different with vaccines on the horizon, but 2 variants later, we know that COVID is a part of our day-to-day lives to this very day. So a lot has happened in 1 year as Joe Biden's presidency turns 1 year old today. And for some insight on this, I wanted to bring in KCBS Radio politics reporter Doug Sovern. And Doug, I watched the almost 2-hour-long press conference that Joe Biden held yesterday. I know that you did too. I followed along on your Twitter feed as well. Just give me your takeaways from what you heard from Joe Biden as he was laying out what this past year has been like and what he would like the next year to look like.
Yeah, almost 2 hours, which I believe is a record. If it's not, it's awfully close. I certainly can't recall any president ever going for that long and staying so long with the media to answer their questions. It was pretty remarkable. But of course, he has not had very many of these. And that's been a bone of contention for the last couple of presidencies, that they just don't have news conferences as regularly as they used to. You know, Joe Biden came out, I think, to sort of lay the case out to the American people because, you know, he says he doesn't believe the polls. He doesn't listen to the polls, but I'm sure he knows what those numbers show, and they're not very strong. I mean, his approval rating in the latest CBS News poll is 44%, which is the lowest of any president not named Donald Trump since we've been polling, and that's consistent across a lot of other polls, Gallup and the like, showing him with pretty low approval ratings, that they've gone steadily downward from the low 60s when he took office to the mid 40s now. Which is not great. And, I think he knows that his message is not being heard, that he hasn't been that effective a messenger. And he owned up to that a bit in this news conference. But I think he wanted to make the case that, look, he's actually done a lot. And from his point of view, more than most presidents have. I mean, he passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill, trillions of dollars that no one's been able to do for many, many years, despite trying. He's managed the pandemic somewhat, not as well, even he admits, as it could have been managed, but got those vaccines into people's arms, got masks out, got testing ramped up, a lot of things that weren't being done when he became president. And I think economically, he can point to incredible, record job growth, more jobs created in 2021 than any year in history. And of course, presidents don't really do much to actually create jobs, but they get credit or blame when there aren't any, or when there are. Record low unemployment, record job creation, the stock market doing well, which of course was Donald Trump's great measure. So, he could come out and say all these things he's done and try to persuade people that he's doing a good job. But a lot of them don't believe it because they see failures in Afghanistan. They see very high inflation, the highest we've seen in decades. They're frustrated that COVID is still with us, that it's not over yet, that, somehow he did not prevent the Omicron variant and the Delta before that. So I think he's trying to sort of reorient the public to his way of thinking that he's actually done a lot. And if they would focus on that, they might be a little happier with him. And his intention is to get out there and sell that message over the next few months.
I think you hit on everything that is at the core of the Biden presidency, the good and perhaps the not so good, and that is the messaging of it all. And it's no big surprise at this point that we're still very much living in a Donald Trump world. And what I mean by that is, for example, Donald Trump would tell you every single day, would tell the American people or anyone who would listen every single day for the 4 years that he was president, all the things that he'd done. You mentioned the stock market. That was something Donald Trump mentioned. He was mentioning the stock market in the coronavirus task force briefing.
Sure.
And he would tell you about all of the judges that he and Mitch McConnell got through. He would tell you about the one piece of legislation he got passed, which was, of course, the tax cut. But he just was a broken record with his accomplishments, whether they were real or imagined, right? Joe Biden in 1 year, as you mentioned, the American Recovery Act, that was in March. That was right after he was elected. Bipartisan infrastructure bill. What did he get? 7 Republicans to vote along? Probably more.
Yeah.
To vote for that in the Senate. The COVID management, the vaccine rollouts, jobs were at 9% unemployment when he took office. Right now at 3.9. That's pretty remarkable considering the pandemic is still going on. So right now, I was just a great messenger for Joe Biden right there in this setup to this. What seems to be the inability or the disconnect for, I don't want to put it all on Joe Biden, but let's say the Biden administration and the inability to communicate a lot of these things to the American public, because you can't have those disapproval numbers, Doug, without losing a lot of your own supporters when you're dipping down into the low 40s. So what's the disconnect there in communicating?
There are a couple of things going on here. For one, you mentioned Donald Trump being hammering home his message all the time. Republicans have always been better at message discipline and message unity, and Donald Trump is a master communicator. This is a guy who, was all over Twitter. Now he's starting his own social media outfit. He knows how to do this. This is what he does. He's a showman. He's a TV host. That's what he does. Joe Biden is, Donald Trump was unconventional. Joe Biden is very much conventional. He's a longtime mainstream Democrat Party insider. He is not going to use Twitter the way Donald Trump did. He's not a braggadocious kind of guy in terms of that. Though we all know he's got the gift of gab and a bit of the blarney, but he's just not that guy, and he's not going to do that. And he wants to be he wants to have a return to normalcy, so to speak, politically. So he's not going to imitate Donald Trump in terms of Twitter, in terms of the way he uses media. Donald Trump had Fox News and all of the other Republican Party propaganda machine to reinforce his message and resonate it through the echo chamber to a willing audience that would lap it up and believe anything they were told. That's not the case for Democrats. I mean, I guess you could argue MSNBC to some extent is the left-wing equivalent of Fox News, but it really isn't. And then you have CNN, which is, left of center, and then you have the mainstream networks. But there's not a single house organ the way there is for the Republicans. They don't coordinate the way Fox and the Trump administration do or did. They don't, it's just not the same kind of apparatus. And then the Democrats are a much more diffuse bunch. Within the Democratic Party, you have a very large progressive wing. You have the Bernie Sanders people who held their noses and voted for Biden. I mean, there are a lot of people in the Democratic Party who voted for Biden who don't really like him and didn't like him that much and are easily turned off to him now, as opposed to in the Republican Party where it's you're on board with Trump, and if you're not, you're just basically excommunicated. So it's just a different environment. It's never going to be the same. It's apples and oranges. So it's harder for a Joe Biden to sustain a message and amplify the message the way that a Donald Trump can. So unless Joe Biden is curing cancer and inflation is at 0 and unemployment is at 1, he's always going to have his critics. Yeah. And those who aren't that enthused about him. And, his personality is such, he's not the most dynamic, articulate, eloquent guy. He's not someone who gets on the stump and stirs you to shivers with his oratory. And he's never going to be that guy. So it's tough for him to try to be something he's not. And to his credit, I don't think he is. He's just being who he is and let the chips fall where they may.
I think it's important to keep in mind that how did Joe Biden become president? I think Joe Biden won the election with overwhelming voter turnout, and key to that was the African Americans who turned out to vote for Joe Biden and these women in the suburbs that may have voted for Trump in 2016 but were really turned off by a lot of his less than appealing character traits, right? Those were going to be pretty fragile coalitions, I think, for Joe Biden, certainly in a first year, as people gauge what is he doing for me, right? They didn't want to see him be pushed too far to the left. And so with Build Back Better, I think with Build Back Better and with voting rights, that's where this thing has kind of come off the rails in this first year. Sure, messaging is a lot of it, but this is also action at this point. Like Biden wanted to put through this transformational spending package and Build Back Better that the American electorate just doesn't really have the appetite for.
Well, I think that a lot of the electorate, if they know the details of what's in those bills, probably do support much of it. But again, what they hear is they can't get it through. Republicans, no. It's liberal spending. And a couple of key Democrats, Manchin and Sinema, saying we can't support this. So what they see and hear is a logjam. Biden can't get it done. Democrats can't pass their agenda. I think if you broke down what's in those bills, for a lot of people, they actually support a lot of that, but they're told that it's some too liberal left-wing package that he can't even pass. And so then they oppose it or throw up their hands and say, oh, see, he's not effective. I don't know that he would argue that he hasn't moved much to the left. Certainly those in the center and to the right would say he's pulling the country way to the left. But I think, again, it's more about what people hear and see as opposed to what's actually being voted on. And, I think that those bills would have passed easily with bipartisan support, 20, 30 years ago.
You mentioned Manchin and Sinema. How much responsibility do they bear for the battering and the bruises that Joe Biden is dealing with right now?
I think they bear quite a bit because he can't get his agenda through, because he has to be seen as wheedling and cajoling and trying to, make concessions and just to get what he wants and what he's promised. I think they bear quite a bit. I mean, but he made a big point of saying in his news conference, look, I've got 48 of the 50 Democrats on board with me. That's incredible. But he can't get a single Republican, even though he said at least 5 of them in the Senate have told him privately they do want to vote for what he's proposing and they support it, but they're afraid to because they know if they do, they'll get a primary challenge from the Trump wing and they could be the end of their career. So they're putting their own survival in Washington ahead of their beliefs and principles and what they believe would be best for their constituents. So if he's telling the truth, and I have a feeling he is actually, then those Republicans certainly bear even more responsibility than Manchin and Sinema. But by blocking this, Manchin and Sinema are basically just in there with those Republicans in that they're not going along with what their party leader wants. Not that they, that they have to. They are ultimately responsible to the people they represent, not the leader of their party. But I think they do bear some of that responsibility, and Biden's got to try to find a way around it, and he just hasn't been able to get that done.
What does a successful second year look like for Biden? And I think there's so much on his plate immediately. One, we're going to see his second big test in foreign policy. I think this Russia-Ukraine situation is really serious. Absolutely. And I think obviously on the domestic front, COVID's going to be the biggie. People are sick of hearing about COVID, though. They are more concerned with their paychecks and the economy and things like that. These are pretty significant things that are going to be on his plate immediately. And then whatever comes up over the course of the year, I don't have a crystal ball. You don't either. But what does a successful second year look like for Joe Biden and his presidency? Yeah,
that's the thing. You never know what's going to happen, right? Right now, Russia, Ukraine, that seems like the big foreign policy test. Who knows? There could be some massive terrorist attack. Something could happen with North Korea, Iran, someplace we're not even thinking of. This is what happens in government and politics. But I do think
COVID.
We could be, COVID. Exactly. Internationally, how he handles Russia and Ukraine, it cannot be another Afghanistan. He's got to handle it the right way. Ideally for him, Putin doesn't go into Ukraine, but if he does, his response has to be strong enough that he doesn't look weak, but we don't provoke another world war. I mean, it's a really tough situation. I'm glad I'm not in charge. And then domestically, certainly the economy and COVID top it. I mean, for him, a successful year means Putin somehow doesn't go into, the threat of American deterrent sanctions, et cetera, is enough to stop Putin from going into Ukraine. COVID peters out, Omicron goes away, there's not another variant that comes in behind it. We start to return to something of a normal life. People start being able to go to the movies and bars and restaurants and not wear masks. Kids are in school. Inflation is held in check and comes back down while unemployment remains low. The stock market roars, the Dow hits 40,000. I mean, that's the kind of year he'd like to see. And frankly, if that happens, if COVID is on the wane, the economy is strong, there's no major international challenges, the midterms look a lot different for him and the Democrats because they're able to sell what he's done and sell their successes and people are in a better mood. It's unrealistic to expect all of that to happen. I just, it's wishful thinking. And I think that's why the midterms remain a considerable challenge for him.
All right. Doug Sovern, political reporter with us at KCBS Radio. Doug, insightful, enjoyable conversation as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to my KCBS Radio colleague, Doug Sovern. And thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the Bay Current podcast, we have new episodes out every day, and we'd love to be part of your daily routine. You can subscribe on the Odyssey app, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or just about anywhere you listen. And every episode is on the KCBS Radio YouTube page, and there's a link in our show notes where you can subscribe there as well. That's it for today's Bay Current. I'm Matt Pitman. We'll chat with you again tomorrow.